Last week's lesson was about a transition in leadership. We are able to, in this past week's study, we were able to look at Moses' final steps, where God took him up on the mountain. Moses was not going to be allowed to lead the Israelites into the Promised Land, but God gave Moses an opportunity to see the Promised Land, that place where this group of people would form their new nation. It was up on that mountain that Moses passed away and the Lord buried him. Joshua was commissioned as the new leader for the Israelites. We had heard in Deuteronomy where Moses commissioned and encouraged Joshua, and in Joshua chapter 1 where the Lord encouraged him. And then the Israelite leaders also encouraged Joshua. Be strong and courageous. Be strong and courageous. And the Lord kept telling Joshua, you want to be a great leader, then you need to know the book of the law. You need to meditate on it day and night. And you need to let that be your guide as you lead the Israelites into this promised land. This week we will look at a transition, really in reading. This is a transition that impacts us as readers, really more so than the story itself. Here's what I mean by that. The first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They're known by a number of different names. The Torah, the Pentateuch, and the books of the law. These are important classification of these 5 books. One of the things we're talking about this year is not just that we know the Bible, but we know how the Bible is put together. The books of the law, history, poetry, prophecy. And we want to know those things and which books fit in those particular classifications. We are transitioning as we move from Deuteronomy to Joshua tonight from a book of the law to the book of history. There are 12 books of history and Joshua is the first book. Joshua is named after the leader. It really is the actions of Joshua as he led the Israelites into the Promised Land. We had talked about in chapter 1 that great message that continued to ring, be strong and courageous, be strong and very courageous. We have some great stories, some only God moments. We think about the Jordan River as the Israelites came up to the edge of it and it stopped flowing. Now this is the river at flood time. We're not talking about just a little bitty river. This was at flood time. It stopped flowing. The Israelites walked across on dry ground. They were able to walk across. Remember, this is 600,000 Israelite men. Add women and children in that. Conservative estimates are, 2.4 million people. There are some who think that the number is significantly higher than that. But it was an only God moment as they walked through and as they left the wilderness, walked through the Jordan River and established their feet in the Promised Land. When you talk about the story of Rahab in the book of Joshua, we are introduced to her in Joshua chapter 2. Her story continues in chapter 6 in the Battle of Jericho, but that's not where her story ends. If we look at Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy of Jesus, there it is. Rahab is listed in the genealogy of Jesus. Throughout the book of Joshua, we read about incredible victories. We'll look at one of those this evening, the victory in the city of Jericho. Again, these are only God moments. I think about walking around a city, shouting, and the walls just caved in. Then there's the story, I believe it's in Joshua chapter 10, where the battle was not quite won, and so they prayed, and the sun stood still. This was a little more than getting an extra hour of daylight, right? But it's an incredible story. This word victory is a little deceptive because we know as we will continue our reading that there were areas that the Israelites did not completely drive out their enemies. And that became a problem. We also know, I was wanting to tonight just to look at the story of the Battle of Jericho, but I couldn't do that because I didn't feel like that completed the story. Because we have to go to Joshua chapter 7 where the Israelites did not fully obey the Lord. And that becomes a theme, unfortunately, of where the Israelites, they followed God, they did what He wanted Him to do right up here to a point. And then there's this area where they didn't follow Him. That's important for us to read. Boy, great lessons for us to learn as we strive to be New Testament Christians and we understand the importance of completely obeying the Word of the Lord. When we look in Joshua, you think about the different statements that are there that are great memory statements like be strong and courageous. But boy, you go to the end of the book and you have Joshua's farewell address. You just can't forget this because this is so powerful. Joshua looks at the nation's farewell address. He says, man, you guys don't give in to the idols. Don't give in to false gods. You need to worship the Lord. You need to serve Him only. Are you able to do that? There's discussion back and forth. That's what Joshua declares. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Great, great story. All right, so let's go through. We're going to just kind of work our way through these first couple of chapters, making our way up to that crescendo with the battle at Jericho. In Joshua chapter 1, the Lord told Joshua to be strong and courageous. We've covered that in great detail. In Joshua chapter 2, that is when Joshua sent a group of spies into Jericho. They hid themselves in Rahab's house. There was a conversation, and part of the deal, if you will, of Rahab hiding them would be that when the Israelites attacked the city, Rahab and her family would be saved. Part 1. Part 2 comes about in the actual story of the Battle of Jericho in chapter 6. Then when we get chapter 3, that is where the Lord demonstrated His power by dividing the Jordan River at flood stage. That was an important moment in the story of the Israelites. I love this. Verse 15 in Joshua 3. Now the Jordan is at full stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. It piled up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the sea of the Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Wow, what a great statement. And we continue, verse 17. The priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, they stopped in the middle of the Jordan, and they stood on dry ground while all of Israel passed by, until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. Then in Joshua chapter 4, there was a moment where they took stones and they built a monument. There's a lot of discussion like that in the Old Testament, and I think there's some great lessons that come with that. Joshua chapter 4, verse 20. Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones that they had taken out of the Jordan. In each of the tribes of Israel, there was a representative who picked up a stone out of the Jordan and they brought it over. They made it into a monument there. He said to the Israelites, in the future when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what He had done to the Red Sea, when He dried it up over before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. Joshua 4 to Joshua 5. Joshua 5 is a reminder of the promise to Abraham. Now, we talked about the promise that God made where He said, I will make your nation, your name will be great, descendants as numerous as stars in the sky, sand on the seashore. Then, I believe it's in Genesis 17 where God established the covenant of circumcision. In Joshua chapter 5, there was a time when the men were circumcised. And I think we need to explain that. I think this is an important point. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeath Haraloth. Now, this is why he did so. All those who came out of Egypt, all the men of military age, died in the wilderness on their way after leaving Egypt. All the people that came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness during the journey from Egypt had not. So that's an important statement that we understand of why that was the case and of why that took place there. While all of these things were taking place, a couple of reports, and it tells us about how other nations were responding to the Israelites because they were hearing about these things. All right? Chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. This is the report that Rahab gave when the spies went into Jericho. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, "I know that the Lord has given you this land and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." Now, I want us to go from there to another passage that kind of gives a report, chapter 5, verse 1. "Now when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, their hearts melted in fear, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites." So we're talking about at least 3 events that become very significant as this news spread out over all the other nations. People are still talking about the Red Sea, something that happened 40 years ago. That as the Israelites were leaving Egypt, that water just separated and they walked through on dry ground. The story of Sihon and Og is an interesting story. If I remember right, that is about in Numbers 21 maybe. But it was a time where the Israelites, they wanted to walk through the land, they wanted to pass through. They weren't going to mess with anything, they just wanted to pass through. And the leader said no, and that ended up turning into a battle, and Sihon and Og were completely destroyed. But now there's also adding something else to it. You have what has taken place at the Jordan River. People have heard about it. People are talking about it. And hearts are melting. Hearts of the enemies are melting. It's quite a story. These are only God moments. Only God could divide the Red Sea. Only God could provide victories in battle. I think back to Exodus 17 with the Amalekites when Moses held up his arms. I think about Sihon and Og, but also I think about the Jordan River and what took place there so the Israelites could cross out of the wilderness into the Promised Land. But when we start talking about only God moments, these are some things, man, only God could do this. That takes us to Joshua chapter 6 and the story of Jericho. Jericho being the first city that they come to after they have crossed into the Promised Land. So let's start. I want to look at that story a little more deeply than the others that we have been through so far in this journey through Joshua. Chapter 6, verse 1. Again, this tells us kind of how the people are responding. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. That speaks of the fear in Jericho. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast of the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, and everyone will go straight in. Now, for a moment, will you join me? I want us to think about being in a planning meeting. We're part of these soldiers, and we're meeting with Joshua. And so we're here, and we're like, Joshua, man, what's the plan? How are we going to take this city? What are we going to do? How's this going to go? Joshua speaks. Well, man, we're going to line up. And we're going to make sure that the Ark of the Covenant is with us. And we're going to have some men before that, and they're going to have their trumpets. We're going to march around that city that first day. We're going to march around that city from one side all the way back around. And we're not going to say a word. And that's it. Day one. Well, when do we attack? All right, day two. Line up. Ark of the Covenant, priests, march around the city. All the way around. We walk all the way around. Don't say a word. That's all. Oh, come on, Joshua, man. We're ready to go in to take this city. Day three. Line up. March all the way around, Ark of the Covenant with the priests. That's it. Joshua, kind of knowing how this goes. What happens on day 4? Same thing. Day 5, same thing. Day 6, same thing. Okay. Now, on day 7, though, on day 7, you get together, you line up, and you go around the city 7 times. Okay. And then the priests are going to blow those horns, and everyone gives a huge shout. And when you shout, those walls are just going to collapse in. You go in and you take the city. Well, wow. Okay. Now, I have to tell you, how would you feel about that game plan? I don't know. I don't know, but I've got to tell you, it's quite the game plan, isn't it? So we get to experience something like that, because here's the thing, is it happened just like Joshua said, because it was just like the Lord had told him. Remember, God said, I have delivered Jericho into your hands. The battle belonged to the Lord. One of the reasons I call these only God moments is because the point is that God does it in such a way that men can't take credit for it. The Israelites could not take credit for it. The Israelite army could not take credit for it. God gave the victory. God gave the victory. All right, now remember, this was the first city, so there was something special about that, and that was that the city was to be destroyed. In detail, let's read this. Chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are in her or with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. I want to stop here for just a minute, because you'd think that the Israelites would have paid attention to that, right? Every single Israelite would have paid attention to that. You don't want to bring about your own destruction by taking any of the devoted items. If you do so, you're going to make the camp of Israel liable to destruction. You're going to bring trouble on the camp. Verse 19, all the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into His treasury. All right. That is Joshua chapter 6, verses 17 through 19. One of the hardest lessons in the book of Joshua takes place in chapter 8. After Joshua is destroyed, and Joshua declares this curse on anyone that tries to rebuild the city of Jericho. So they know that Ai is next. It's not that big. So they send 3,000 soldiers, and they get routed. 36 soldiers died. They come back, and Joshua is devastated. He tears his clothes and he bows down to the ground. The elders follow suit, and they did the same thing. And then in Joshua chapter 7, verse 10, the Lord said to Joshua, stand up. What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen, they have lied, they have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they've been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. In other words, deal with the sin in your camp. Joshua chapter 7 is a powerful story. They line up everybody and they go through these different ways of dividing by tribes and then by families. And next thing you know, it turns to Achan. Joshua turns to Achan and he says, give glory to the Lord. Now that's a solemn oath that says, tell the truth. What have you done? And Achan admitted it. He said, I did it. I took a robe, I took some silver, and I took a bar of gold. They went and investigated and they found the things right where Achan said they were. And that was the day that Achan and his entire family were punished. They were stoned for taking some of the devoted things. This was something that the Lord had specifically said, do not do. But I don't know if this is how it played out, but I can tell you, if I'm applying this in today's term, what would take place is he'd say, nobody will notice. It's just this little bit. There's so much there. Nobody will notice if I help myself to a little bit of this. God noticed. God noticed. So I think about it, because there's some great lessons from that story, by the way. Great lessons for us. God has made it clear what He expects of us. But our attitude, as I see in life so far, is so often we're like, it's just this little thing. It's just one Sunday. It's just a little white lie. It's just taking this small thing. It's just that. And we act like, well, I'm going to pick and choose the things I obey, but this is just a little thing. I don't know that there are little things to God. Not like that. So as a church, one of the greatest lessons I ever heard on this story was from a friend of mine, Larry Cantrell. Larry is one of the lead ministers in the Nashville Inner City Ministry, and he talked about this story, and his message was about sin in the camp. And he talked about the danger of sin in the church. Now, this was a lesson he presented over 30 years ago. And boy, I wish that I could have him today to share that same message. With the experiences of what we have seen and the changes in church over the last 30 years. Because I've got to tell you, church, this is not an easy way to end this lesson. This is not the beautiful way that I'd like to end this lesson. But the lesson in Joshua chapter 7 that comes, this Joshua 6 to Jericho, that's an only God moment and is met with this horrible after effect, leaves this bad taste in our mouth, and it's because there was sin in the camp. Because one person saw himself as too good to obey all the words of the Lord. So when we have in the church, when we have sin in the camp, and we just let it go. Now, I'm as guilty of that as some of you may be. And I've got to tell you this, we can't keep doing this. The Bible is too clear. The Bible is clear that sin must be addressed so that we can walk faithfully with the Lord. I look at what takes place in the rest of the story of Joshua and of how they didn't completely follow the word of the Lord and completely drive out all the enemies. And by the time we get to the beginning of Judges, we find out this is just not going to go well. It's going to have a rough season. And it did. So how do we address sin? Well, just a couple of passages for you to keep with you and take with you as we close our time tonight. Matthew chapter 18 says that you go and you address the sin. You don't have to just go blab it to the whole church. You address the sin with a brother or sister. You take another person and address it with them. Then if you have to tell the whole church, tell the whole church. But if you get to the point where you have to tell the whole church, you have to treat them as a tax collector or a sinner. And that's serious business. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, we have this story, and it's just a horrible moment of a man involved in sexual sin. And as they go down and we talk about the importance of addressing sin in the church, one of the things they'll say is that when you've got people that are sinning like that, and you don't even need to eat with people like that. That's part of missing the fellowship of the church. You don't even need to eat with them. Then in Titus chapter 3, it talks about people that are divisive in the church, which is an incredible sin in the church, of trying to take God's people and split them apart. And what Paul would tell Titus is he'd say, man, don't have anything to do with them. Don't have anything to do with them. We want to bring people to repentance. Now we've got a story from the Old Testament of where God was that serious about these initial steps. And you have to remember, they had the Lord's specific directive in how to handle each of these offenses. What we have in the New Testament is the Word of God in its entirety for us to follow in the New Testament church. And that's why we keep pointing. I told an Old Testament story, but when it comes to how to address sin in the camp, we need to look at New Testament scriptures and make sure that we're following that path that the Lord has laid out for us. I want to hope that we would understand of the blessings that would come about if we would follow the Lord's will, completely, wholeheartedly obey the word of the Lord. Because God desires to bless His people. I firmly believe that God has a desire to see the church grow and to see the kingdom of God spread, where people throughout our community find out about Jesus and humbly submit themselves to Him. And they're baptized, they're immersed for the remission of their sins. And they come up out of that water, they're raised to walk a new life. And then 1 by 1 and 2 by 2 and 5 by 5. And we just continue to spread. And it grows exponentially. And why is that? Because we have chosen to be a people who trust God, who trust His Word, who trust His way. We walk in obedience, and man, we just hand it to God. We hand it to God. We ask God to bless the efforts of His servants. Because it is still true. The battle belongs to the Lord.